About 10 miles outside China's 11th largest city lies a graveyard. Its occupants aren't human, nor are they dead, though they have seen better days. These hundreds and hundreds of little white rectangles are cars, electric cars, victims of China's incredibly rapid and unparalleled automotive revolution. When this Chang'an Edo debuted in 2015 with a range of just over 120 miles and a top speed of less than 90 miles an hour, it was among the country's best-selling EVs. At the time, China exported only about 375,000 cars a year, less than India or the United States, and a tiny fraction of Japan or Germany. For the next 5 years, it made only modest progress. Then, while the rest of the world was stuck indoors, China leaped ahead of India, followed by the US, and is on track to beat both Germany and Japan to become #1 this year. Today, the Chang'an Edo is but a forgotten relic, an iPod, functional yet worthless. In its place, Chinese drivers have hundreds of models to choose from. There's the BYD Han, a Tesla Model S in form and function for nearly half the price. There's the Wuling Bingo, an innovative hatchback equipped with a built-in inflatable mattress. There's the best-selling Hongguang Mini, a $5,000 4-seat street-legal microcar. And for those decidedly not on a budget, the $700,000 Rolls-Royce of China, the Hongqi L5, proudly used by none other than Xi Jinping. How did China go from 500 EVs on the streets of Shanghai in 2011 to being the undisputed leader in electric cars today? Sponsored by Ground News, the platform where you can easily compare news sources, protect against media bias, and stay on top of headlines. This is what China's most populous city looked like in April 2000. You'll notice lots of bikes, quite a few scooters, and even some buses. What you don't see a lot of are cars. Just 4 million were on the road for a population of 1.3 billion, a number surpassed by the United States somewhere around 1910. But by 2005, car ownership had more than tripled, and its streets looked like this. Suddenly, China had an oil problem. The basic challenge can be boiled down to just 2 numbers. China consumes upwards of 13% of the world's oil, yet is home to a mere 1.5%. The rest it mainly imports from the Middle East. Not only does this make it incredibly dependent on a small handful of countries, but because the vast majority of this oil arrives on tankers, it also depends on the generosity of the US Navy to patrol these waters, not to mention the goodwill of every nation along this route. Needless to say, not ideal. China also had a pollution problem. To this day, more of its citizens die of pollution each year than live in Hawaii. That's well over 4,000 deaths on the average day. While the country is no stranger to environmental destruction, these costs are typically borne disproportionately by the less socioeconomically advantaged. In other words, nickel mines, coal plants, and megadams are built where residents are powerless to stop them. Air pollution, by contrast, is often worse in its most populous and wealthy coastal cities. According to one estimate, 38% of the Chinese population lives in an area where the average air quality would be deemed unhealthy by the EPA. Many of 21st century China's largest protests have revolved around air pollution. Enter electric vehicles. Beijing calculated that nearly a third of its smog was caused by cars, and that even if all of its electricity were sourced from coal, EVs would still generate fewer emissions than internal combustion engines. For years, China had been trying to catch up to German and Japanese automakers by forcing them to work with local companies. Except rather than stealing from their foreign counterparts, as is often imagined, Chinese engineers became dependent on them. Eventually, the Chinese government realized it simply wasn't going to win. So it decided to start a new race, one in which its competitors' head start was actually a disadvantage. Mercedes and Toyota and Ford were complacent. Unlike traditional cars, EVs were perfectly compatible with China's economy. Where internal combustion engines rely on small amounts of high-skill, high-cost labor, EVs rely on relatively larger amounts of low-skill, low-cost labor. By value, an electric car is essentially a battery wrapped in some packaging. And batteries, to grossly oversimplify, are commodities. Like any commodity, the cost would inevitably go down with scale. The challenge was sustaining these companies until they reached profitability. China's solution was to just buy from them. After the 2008 financial crisis, Chinese cities helped stimulate the economy by buying loads and loads of electric buses and taxis. By 2014, Shenzhen had more than 1,200. 3 years later, all 17,000 of its buses were electric. Then came the subsidies. Billions and billions worth of subsidies. At one point, buyers could save as much as $16,000 per EV. But although the Chinese government may have handed out as much as $100 billion, these subsidies weren't the biggest reason people bought electric cars. In a 2016 survey, 52% of respondents said they would not have purchased their EV if not for its license plate. Most Chinese cities distribute new license plates by lottery, auction, or both. In 2016, the odds of winning the Beijing lottery were 1 in 667. In Shanghai, plates can sell for $10,000 or more. And even with plates, you may only be allowed to drive on certain days of the week. Buy an EV, on the other hand, and you'll automatically receive a special green license plate, no lottery or auction necessary. Green plates are China's American Express Platinum, a mass-market golden ticket to drive on any day of the week, and in some places, park for free. Unsurprisingly, these policies worked. A little too well. The country became saturated with hundreds of nearly identical brands. It wasn't so much that China was propping up uncompetitive companies, as hundreds of cities were each propping up their uncompetitive companies. It was as if Seattle, Minneapolis, Houston, and Pittsburgh each had its own Tesla competitor. Rather than let the best EV win, each region was too dependent on its local champion to allow its failure. On one hand, this unusually saturated market means Chinese consumers have more choices than any other country. Take a look, for instance, at EV sales in America. At first glance, this may look like success. But if we remove the largest company, you can see that EVs haven't really grown over time. Tesla has. Americans effectively have 4 models from one major brand to choose from. By contrast, Chinese companies released 107 new models last year alone, from ultra-affordable mini EVs to ones where you can quickly swap out your battery at one of thousands of stations instead of waiting for a charge. On the other hand, 500 companies is just too many, even for a country as large as China. So, around 2016, the Communist Party did something uncharacteristic. It let capitalism take the wheel. Subsidies have been slowly phased out, and local governments prohibited from favoring one company over another. At the same time, Beijing dropped a nuclear bomb on the Chinese auto industry. After decades of carefully nurturing local companies, the Chinese government rolled out the red carpet for a foreign competitor. For the first time ever, Tesla was given permission to build its 9 million square foot Shanghai factory without working with a joint Chinese partner. And that's not all. Inspired by California, Beijing instituted a credit system. Every automaker is now required to sell a certain number of EVs for each conventional car it produces. Those who fall short must make up the difference by purchasing credits from their competitors. Since Tesla only produces EVs, it earned nearly $1.6 billion from selling credits in 2020 alone. Without this revenue, the company would have lost $859 million overall that year. One could argue that Tesla was the largest beneficiary of Chinese state involvement in the entire industry. Protectionism? Sure, for an American company. Chinese companies were suddenly on their own. Meanwhile, here was this 800-pound gorilla with a stronger brand than all the rest combined. To make matters worse, Tesla, still on the high end, lowered the cost of its two most popular models by 6% and 13%. What happened next was an all-out price war. In the space of just a few short years, something like 80% of China's EV companies collapsed. NIO, one of its largest, lost $131,000 for every car it sold. But this consolidation, painful as it was, had the effect Beijing intended. Those that survived have thrived. Today, about 40% of new car sales in China are electric. Of them, one Chinese company, BYD, sells more than the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh place brands combined. It's on track to sell more electric cars than Volkswagen will sell cars of any kind this year. Tesla is the only foreign car maker not in decline. The days of Ford, Honda, and BMW dominating the Chinese market are over, and the tide is beginning to flow in the opposite direction. Chinese cars can now be found in Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Belgium, the UK, Chile, and Australia, to name just a few. Meanwhile, at a time when China is embracing the free market, it's now America's turn to resort to protectionism. Previously, nearly every EV buyer in America could receive a $7,500 tax credit. Now, only cars whose batteries were produced in North America and whose minerals were processed by a US ally are eligible. America is trying to out-China China, to impose the same restrictions it once criticized Beijing for. But will it work? First, consider demand. In a recent survey, the average American said they would need a range of over 500 miles to consider buying an EV, the most of any country. Chinese consumers had the lowest expectations, about half as many. It makes sense. China has fast and efficient high-speed trains for longer journeys. For Americans, car ownership is a way of life. Most Chinese consumers are buying their first ever car. They value its interface as much as, if not more than, its performance. In other words, Chinese and American consumers are different. Secondly, there's supply. The Chinese government didn't attempt to manifest a battery industry out of thin air. It subsidized those that already existed. BYD, the country's largest EV brand as you'll recall, began in fact as a battery maker. It successfully produced phone batteries for years before refocusing on cars. America doesn't have those companies to subsidize. It's effectively starting from scratch. Finally, the most effective Chinese policies were coercive. A civil war would break out before the United States would restrict the days of the week on which you can drive. All of this suggests America has a tough road ahead. Never mind that it's starting this race about 15 to 20 years too late. As of today, just 25 models of cars are eligible for the new $7,500 federal tax credit. The other 70% of all electric, hydrogen, and hybrid cars sold in America are ineligible. Biden's Inflation Reduction Act is an attempt to have it both ways. to increase the number of EVs on America's roads while simultaneously decreasing China's dominance. But the reality is, China has spent decades building up its supply chain. Nearly every electric car company in the world depends on its batteries. It refines over half of the world's lithium and 3/4 of the world's nickel and cobalt. A world without China is, at least for now, a world without EVs. Nearly 40% of EVs in America are registered in a single state, California. And one of the reasons for this incredible polarization is their media coverage. In choosing what, and perhaps more importantly, what not to include, journalists have no choice but to introduce bias. And although we may be aware of this bias, it's often invisible until compared side by side with other sources covering the same story, something few of us have the time or energy to do. Enter today's sponsor, Ground News. Take this story about Ford layoffs amid the EV transition. With Ground News, we can see that of these 24 sources, 20% are left-leaning and 50% right-leaning. We can also see how each one is covering the same story differently, revealing its hidden narrative underneath. For example, notice how 3 out of 4 left-leaning publications mention these are white-collar jobs, whereas 8 out of 10 right-leaning publications omit this fact entirely. We can even click on one of these sources and see where it gets its funding. Ground News makes being an informed consumer of the news easy, with Android and iOS apps, including my personal favorite, widgets for your home screen, and even browser extensions. For a limited time, get 30% off your subscription by clicking the link on screen or in the description. Thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video.